Imagine standing inside an ancient Egyptian tomb. Not a museum, not an archaeological site, not a ruin, a real tomb, and it is still being used. The year is around 1250 BCE. You are on the western side of Thebes. Outside, the sun is dropping behind the desert hills. Inside, oil lamps throw weak yellow light across painted walls. Behind you, several men are carrying a coffin deeper underground. Family members are crying near the entrance. Priests are speaking words you don't fully understand. Servants are carrying baskets, jars, boxes, food, furniture, clothing, and small human-shaped statues. And somewhere behind all of them, workers are preparing to close the tomb. Soon, everyone will leave. The entrance will be sealed. The lights will disappear. And the person inside this coffin is supposed to remain here for eternity. But what actually happened inside an Egyptian tomb after the funeral ended? Did the mummy simply lie there in darkness? Did priests return? Did the family enter the burial chamber again? Did food really stay beside the dead? What happened to the body? And why did so many tombs eventually end up broken open, emptied, and scattered? To answer that, forget Tutankhamun for a moment. Most Egyptians were not pharaohs. Most did not receive rooms full of gold. So today, we're following the burial of a wealthy but non-royal Egyptian family in New Kingdom Thebes. And the first surprise is that an Egyptian tomb was not simply one room containing a mummy. It was closer to a machine designed to keep a person alive after death. Ancient Egyptian tomb complexes could separate spaces intended for the living from spaces intended for the dead. At Deir el-Medina, for example, New Kingdom craftsmen built above-ground offering chapels, while shafts led down into underground corridors and burial chambers that could hold multiple generations of the same family. That means there were effectively two tombs. The tomb the family could visit, and the tomb they were not supposed to enter again. Above ground, relatives could bring offerings, say prayers, remember the dead, perform rituals. Below ground was the burial chamber, the private zone, the place where the mummy and funerary equipment would remain hidden. So when Hollywood shows people casually walking past a mummy every time they visit a tomb, that's not really how the system was supposed to work. The burial chamber was meant to disappear from normal human life. But first, the dead person had to be placed inside it. By the time the funeral procession arrived, the body had already been through the long process of mummification. Internal organs such as the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines could be removed, embalmed separately, and placed in 4 canopic jars or containers protected by funerary deities. The goal was not to create a creepy corpse for a future museum. The goal was preservation. The body mattered because Egyptian ideas about continued existence after death depended heavily on maintaining the deceased's identity. Your body, your name, your image, your possessions, your relationship with the gods. They all formed pieces of the same survival system. And now that preserved body is arriving at the tomb. Picture the coffin being pulled or carried toward the entrance. Family members mourn. Priests perform rituals. Incense burns. Offerings are presented. Then comes one of the strangest and most important ceremonies of the entire funeral, the opening of the mouth. A priest uses special ritual equipment near the face of the mummy or a statue representing the deceased. To a modern observer, the ceremony might look symbolic. To Egyptians, it had an enormous purpose. The ritual was intended to restore the dead person's senses, the ability to breathe, to speak, to see, to hear, to eat, to drink. In other words, the mummy was not being treated as something finished. It was being prepared to function again. Think about how strange that would feel if you were standing there. A corpse is in front of you. You know the person has died. Everyone knows the person has died. And yet the entire ceremony is built around the idea that death is not the end of activity. The dead person still needs food, still needs water, still needs protection, still needs a functioning body, still needs a place to live. Which is why the burial chamber begins to look less like a grave and more like an apartment for eternity. As the coffin moves deeper underground, objects come with it. Clothing, sandals, containers, furniture, food, cosmetics, jewelry, tools, personal possessions, funerary objects made specifically for the afterlife. But there is one category of object that looks especially strange. Tiny people, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds. Small mummiform figures made from materials such as wood, stone, pottery, or faience. These are shabdas, and they have a job. Literally. Egyptians imagined that the deceased might be called upon to perform labor in the afterlife. Work in fields, move sand, irrigate land, do the sort of manual tasks nobody really wants to spend eternity doing. So wealthy Egyptians developed a brilliant solution. Send somebody else. Shabti figures were intended to substitute for the deceased if he or she was called to work in the afterlife. Think about what that means. Ancient Egyptians invented outsourcing. For death, you die, you reach the afterlife. Someone says, "Time to work." And ideally, one of your tiny magical employees answers, "I'll handle it." Even death couldn't completely eliminate bureaucracy, but the Shabtis were only part of the protection system. Look at the walls. If this is a decorated burial chamber, you may see gods, protective figures, prayers, funeral scenes, images of the dead person standing before divine beings, texts taken from funerary traditions. Those words were not decoration in the modern sense. They were equipment. Imagine you're about to travel somewhere dangerous. You pack a map, food, documents, medicine, instructions, emergency equipment. Egyptians did something similar for death. Except their journey wasn't across a desert. It was through the afterlife. The Book of the Dead was not one identical book placed in every tomb. Different people could possess different selections of spells. Those texts were meant to help the deceased overcome dangers, pass through the world of the dead, interact with gods, and successfully continue existence. So now look around the burial chamber again. The mummy is not alone. There are words on the walls, images of gods, Shabtis waiting to work, food, containers, clothing, furniture, protective objects, canopic equipment, and depending on wealth, jewelry, a lot of jewelry, which creates a problem, because the Egyptians have just placed valuable objects underground, then told everyone exactly where the cemeteries are. But we'll come back to that. For now, the burial is not finished. The coffin has to be positioned. A wealthy burial may involve more than one coffin layer. A royal burial could become spectacularly elaborate, but that was royal wealth, not the normal Egyptian experience. Our non-royal tomb is simpler, still expensive, still impressive, but not a room made of gold. The coffin is set into place. Canopic equipment is positioned nearby. Boxes are arranged. Jars are sealed. Shabtis are stored. Funerary possessions fill the available space. Some objects may have been used during life. Others exist specifically because the owner died. Then food and drink enter the story. Bread, beer, water, perhaps meat or other provisions depending on the burial and period. Why put food beside someone who cannot physically eat it? Because Egyptian funerary belief did not treat food only as physical calories. Offerings could sustain the deceased spiritually. And crucially, this did not end when the burial chamber was closed. Offering tables were placed in tomb chapels so water and food offerings could provide continuing nourishment for the deceased. This is where many people misunderstand Egyptian tombs. After the funeral, the family was not supposed to crawl down into the burial chamber every week carrying lunch. The underground chamber could remain sealed. The accessible chapel above or near it allowed the relationship between the living and dead to continue. The architecture changes across Egyptian history. But the important idea remains. The dead had a private space. The living had a ritual space. So now the final people begin leaving the chamber. A worker checks the objects. A priest finishes the ritual. Family members take one last look. The lamps move toward the entrance. And then, the tomb becomes darker. One lamp disappears. Then another. Footsteps move farther away. The coffin sits motionless. The final entrance to the burial space is blocked, sealed. And for the first time since the burial began, nobody is inside. Now we can finally answer the question. What actually happened in there? Physically? Almost nothing. And that's exactly what the Egyptians wanted. No secret mechanical traps suddenly activate. No mummy sits up. No magical curse fills the air. No snakes pour from the walls. The burial chamber becomes still, dark, dry, quiet. The body remains wrapped inside its coffin. The goods remain arranged around it. Dust slowly settles. Organic materials age. Insects, dampness, or environmental conditions may damage certain objects depending on the tomb. But in Egypt's dry environment, some materials could survive extraordinarily well. Linen, wood, papyrus, food, human remains. Objects never designed to survive 3,000 years sometimes did exactly that, which creates a strange split between physical reality and Egyptian belief. Physically, the tomb becomes silent. Religiously, it has just become active. The rituals, texts, images, body, offerings, and equipment were all designed so that the deceased could continue existing. From the Egyptian point of view, sealing the door did not trap the dead person. It completed the system. The dead could receive offerings. The deceased could travel through the afterlife. Protective spells could work. Shaptas could answer when labor was demanded. Images could provide things that were no longer physically available. And the preserved identity of the tomb owner could continue. The tomb wasn't supposed to imprison death. It was supposed to defeat it. That may be the biggest difference between how we see Egyptian tombs and how Egyptians saw them. To us, a tomb is where somebody's life ends. To them, the tomb was part of the equipment needed for life to continue. And everything works perfectly, as long as nobody opens the door. Which, unfortunately, people did. Imagine the tomb 20 years later, or 50, or 100. The family that buried the owner may be gone. Political conditions have changed. The cemetery is still visible, and somebody knows there is jewelry behind that wall. Maybe gold, maybe valuable wood, maybe linen, maybe oil, maybe objects that can be reused. Now the tomb isn't only an eternal house. It's a locked warehouse, and somebody decides to break in. Tomb robbery was not invented by modern treasure hunters. Ancient Egyptian documents themselves record investigations into tomb theft. That means Egyptian authorities faced a deeply awkward problem. They spent enormous resources protecting the dead from other Egyptians. Robbers could break through walls or entrances, move through passages, open coffins, remove jewelry, strip valuable materials, break funerary objects, and sometimes damage the mummy itself while searching for hidden valuables. Some ancient mummies were plundered so violently that bones were scattered while thieves searched for jewelry or amulets. Ancient restorers sometimes gathered remains, rebuilt mummies, and rewrapped them. Think about how disturbing that would have been to Egyptians. This isn't simply theft. The entire burial system depends on keeping the deceased intact and supplied. A robber doesn't just steal your necklace. He threatens your eternity, and royal tombs were not immune. So Egyptian authorities sometimes did something extraordinary. They moved the dead. Centuries after certain kings had been buried, priests relocated royal mummies whose tombs had become vulnerable. More than 50 royal and elite mummies and pieces of funerary equipment were eventually hidden together in the famous Theban royal cache, now known as TT-320. The goal was protection from tomb robbers. Imagine the scene. A king has been dead for hundreds of years. His original funeral is ancient history even to the Egyptians moving him. Priests enter his tomb, lift the mummy, carry the dead pharaoh through the darkness, move him to another hidden location, perhaps combine him with rulers from completely different generations. The eternal house failed, so the dead had to move. Again, and that may be the strangest thing that really happened inside Egyptian tombs. They were designed to remain unchanged forever, but Egyptian history kept changing around them. Families disappeared. Dynasties collapsed. Economic conditions worsened. Robbers arrived. Priests repaired damaged mummies. Coffins were reused. Objects were stolen. Burials were moved. And eventually, the people who created the tomb could no longer protect it. Then centuries became millennia. Languages changed. Religions changed. Cities disappeared. Sand moved. Entrances vanished. The tomb sat underground until someone opened it again. Maybe ancient robbers, maybe local diggers, maybe archaeologists. Imagine being the first person to enter an intact chamber after thousands of years. Your lamp touches walls nobody has seen since the funeral. There are footprints in the dust. Objects still sit where ancient hands placed them. Sealed jars remain closed. A coffin still holds the person whose family once stood in exactly the same place. Suddenly, archaeology becomes incredibly personal. Because you're not looking at ancient Egypt. You're looking at one person's attempt not to disappear. Their sandals, their furniture, their food, their name, their body, their idea of eternity. That's what an Egyptian tomb really was. Not a treasure chest, not a haunted room, not a puzzle designed for archaeologists, and definitely not a giant collection of traps waiting for Indiana Jones. It was an engineered continuation of human life. The body preserved identity. The coffin protected the body. The tomb protected the coffin. The spells protected the deceased. The gods protected the journey. The Shabdas handled the work. The offerings provided nourishment. The chapel allowed the living to keep supporting the dead. Every piece had a purpose, and there is something deeply human underneath all of it. Ancient Egyptians faced the same fact you do. Everybody dies. They simply refused to treat death as the end of the story. So they built rooms under mountains, carved prayers into stone, wrapped bodies in linen, filled jars, painted gods, prepared food, made tiny workers, protected names, and closed the door, hoping the person inside would never truly disappear. But here's the question. Imagine you're standing at the entrance again. The burial is over. Everyone else has left. The oil lamp in your hand has enough fuel for 1 hour. In front of you is the sealed burial chamber. Behind it, a mummy, food, jewelry, Shabdas, Canopic jars, painted gods, and complete darkness. Would you spend one night inside? Because the people ancient Egyptians feared most weren't ghosts. They were very much alive, and some of them made a living by breaking into tombs, opening coffins, and stealing from the dead. What happened when an ancient Egyptian tomb robber got caught? That's the next secret of ancient Egypt.